Thank you. So good morning, everyone. My name is May Maloney, and I am a Senior Program Director for Leadership and Impact at Leadership Greater Hartford. So excited to start my morning with you. Thank you for starting your morning with us. And thank you to those who've been with us since the beginning of this series. Since 2010, Lessons in Leadership has been a unique way for our network to come together for continued leadership development, relationship building. And really, this is a mashup between sort of a book club, leadership training, and some virtual networking. It's a chance to engage or re-engage around a timely issue by drawing on LGH's human-centered leadership approach, and drawing on insights from a dynamic author and the perspectives of those in the room. And that's all of you. So this year, with the many challenges facing our communities, each of our facilitators are using concepts of the themes of Brené Brown's newest book, Strong Ground, as a catalyst for conversation. There's going to be lots of sharing, lots of learning. On your screen now, you see some virtual norms for our meeting room. None of these are going to be surprises, I don't think. So while this is designed to be an interactive session, we do have everybody on mute so we can eliminate some background noise. Later in the morning, when we are brought into breakout rooms, you'll have an opportunity to be unmuted and you can certainly share. In the meantime, feel free to use the chat for questions, comments, if there's anything that you want to raise, and our team will help kind of mine some of that and offer some questions to our facilitator. If you have any technical issues or glitches, Larissa is here. You can just write to Leadership Greater Hartford and she will be able to help navigate any technical issues that you might have. So before moving on, we always want to thank our series sponsors, CIL and CREC. Today's session and the entire series would not be possible without their support. CIL is a Hartford-based 501c3 nonprofit real estate developer and community partner focused on creating and sustaining accessible, supportive housing and community resources for people with disabilities and other long-term support needs. Since its founding, CIL has partnered with service providers and communities to expand inclusive housing options, improve independence, and enhance quality of life through development consulting, accessibility improvements, and innovative community investments. Capital Region Education Council, or CREC, is a regional educational service center serving more than 30 districts in Greater Hartford, providing a wide range of high-quality programs and services that support students, educators, and families. CREC's work includes professional development for educators, operation of tuition-free inter-district magnet schools, customized educational programming, and collaborative services that advance equity, excellence, and opportunity to learners of all ages. To learn more about CIL or CREC, please visit their websites that Larissa is going to put into the chat. Again, thank you to all of our friends at CIL and CREC for your investment and longtime support of Leadership Greater Hartford. Would also like to thank our visionary sponsors as seen on the screen. These partners have invested in our year-long alumni engagement events, including Lessons in Leadership. If there's any individuals in the room representing these organizations, please give a wave or say hello in the chat. If your organization is interested in becoming an LGH sponsor, please email us so we can design a sponsorship package that is meaningful to your company. Thank you so much for your support. If you're not already connected with us on social media, please be sure to follow us. This is a great way to support Leadership Greater Hartford and help others learn about the programming and events that we have available. And we hope that you'll connect with us frequently after today's session. So today is session 4. We hope that you have been able to join some of the first 3 sessions. I think some of you have come to all of them, which is wonderful. But either way, you can find recordings of each of the first 3 sessions on our YouTube channel, and you'll receive recordings of the sessions after today's conversation. We are so grateful for our dynamic facilitators, including today's facilitator, Mari Serrano. Mariana is a public health practitioner, educator, and organizational development consultant. She is the founder and principal of the Cadence of Social Impact, a mission driven consulting practice that provides organizational development services while reinvesting profits into micro grants and community centered initiatives. She also teaches part time at my alma mater, Eastern Connecticut State University, in their health science and nursing department. With experience spanning public health, academia, grassroots organizing, entrepreneurship, and systems level strategy, Madi partners with universities, healthcare institutions, advocacy networks, grassroots organizations, and local coalitions to support them in transforming their work into measurable, sustainable impact. She collaborates closely with leadership and teams to identify opportunities, design strategies, and implement initiatives that are responsive to the needs and voices of the communities that they serve. Her work integrates evidence-based frameworks with culturally responsive practices, innovative problem solving, and strategic thinking, helping organizations not only meet their goals, but also build long-term capacity, resilience, and equity-driven systems for lasting change. As a perpetual learner and bridge builder, Madi leads with authenticity, integrity, and curiosity, guided by the conviction that lasting change happens when communities are empowered and systems honor their leadership. Madi's mantra is I lead with clarity, courage, and care, rooted in my purpose for why I'm here, guided by a vision and source bigger than me, and grounded in communities that have always supported me. Madi, I am excited to welcome you to this space yet again. I know you were a facilitator a few years ago. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, May. Good morning, everyone. It's so good to see y'all's faces this morning. I know it's so early, so I just want to invite y'all to stretch a little bit. I don't know about y'all, but I kind of rolled out of bed this morning and made it here, but I see you have some coffee in your hand. So just take a moment to just, open up your arms a little bit, to probably wiggle yourself around. Yeah, just kind of just check in and sit in your body for a moment. I know when we're on these virtual spaces, it's important to just check in and how you're feeling today, right? So it's an invitation to move your body for a moment, but also to breathe, right? To take a breath in, to get centered in this space, right? We are humans, we're having a human experience, and yeah, it's early. So let's start with a quick moment to yourself. Hmm. All right. So, first off, as you are getting settled in, I do want to open up our session with just acknowledging the amazing folks who were a part of this book, right? So, Brene Brown held it down with bringing some incredible teachers to strong ground. And this is sort of an opportunity to just reflect on all the wisdom that they have brought us, right? And so, here we have teachers, educators, thinkers, practitioners whose experiences really helped us in this book series understand what grounded leadership looks like in practice, right? Their voices really helped us think through really some hard leadership practices that we often talk about, but are often the elephant in the room, like accountability, power, right? What it means to have courage in this time and to really work together, right, to build a practice of leadership. And what does that look like in relationship with others? They remind us that leadership is not only a skill set and a gift, right, that often I think we reflected on, that requires a version of us that may not be a part of our job descriptions or what we get paid for, right, but it's a part of our practice and how we show up in our humanity. It's not attached to a title, but it's a way of being with one another in community, right? It's relational. And so the closing session of our time together is especially for lessons in leadership rooted in this Strong Ground book by Brene Brown. The learning arc here for our session is how do we actually explore leadership from a lens of cultivating accountability, connection, and grounded in hope, even through complex environments and times, right? And so throughout the program, we have reflected on our values, our mission clarity, and the paradoxes of leadership. And for today's session, I really want to invite y'all to consider what it means to also practice leadership in relationship with others, right? Others, when you think about who are we working on our team with, in community with, often are our mirrors in leadership, right? They show us, um, courage. They show us responsibility and what showing up in humanity looks like. And often when we're in relationship with people, we get feedback, we get curious, we also share power dynamics, right? And so this session is really going to be really rooted on chapter 17 and 22, on strong ground, and really just focusing on anchoring us in those values. And also, how do we make make ourselves accountable to the daily decisions, that we make every day, right? To shape trust in our organizations and our communities. So, with that being said, I just wanted to get grounded with y'all and then open us up with this foundational question around how do we lead in ways that sustain trust, responsibilities, and hope? Just pause there for a moment. How do we lead in ways that sustain trust, accountability, and hope? Right? This is like a very powerful question. And as we're like in space today, I want to encourage y'all to put your thoughts in the chat, right? If you really want to come off mute and share some wisdom, like raise your hand, let us know, right? So this is an interactive session, so I do want to invite that. But for me, and I'll speak from my experience while reading Strong Ground, leadership is not only about vision or strategy, right? These are two important concepts that we absolutely need in leadership. But it's actually about how we show up with others, how we build trust, how we practice accountability, right? How we respond to moments of challenge and uncertainty. These closing chapters really remind us that leadership happens as small micro moments, right, when they matter the most, and often between stimulus and response, right? So we're going to go back to that in a moment. But these moments, leaders make choices that either reinforce connection and integrity to the values that they hold themselves accountable, or we, you know, are reactive and erode trust because there is a safety or a fear component that comes up often when you're under the gun, or under pressure, excuse me, right? And so when you think about what those micro moments are, right, that's when leadership actually means the most. It's not when things are going beautifully as planned, but when things actually are very challenging. Glenn, I see your hand. I want to bring you in.
Yeah, I was gonna. Am I echoing a lot?
Yeah.
Hold on.
Try one more time, friend. Hopefully it works. So, Heather, you said modeling behavior that provides space for trust, responsibility, and hope. Yes, absolutely. Modeling that way. And I want to talk more about, Heather, how we do that, right? What does that modeling look like in practice? Um,
Any?
Terry, oh, no,
All
I'm
right,
sorry.
I'll put something in the chat.
Okay, please do. Thank you. Terry, you mentioned how do we lead in ways that sustain trust, responsibility, hope, being authentic, having empathy, and listening and being vulnerable. Absolutely. Right? These are all ways in which we can show up. And I think like and Glenn, we're waiting for you to chime in here. But I'll move us forward to say, like, when we think about leading in ways that sustain trust and responsibility and hope, I often think about, well, what are we responsible to and for and what, right? what exactly, how are we building trust? From what lens and perspective are we building trust? And how is hope really important in all of this, right? Like these are questions, even within this question for me, of like, how do we actually lead and what am I really responsible and accountable to? Right? And so just like holding ourselves and others accountable is important. Glenn, you said how we define leadership is critical, right? When we think about um, leaders, we are in communities with followers, right? Yes, absolutely. And listen, leadership is challenging, right? It's not always it feels good at moments, but sometimes it could be like us making some hard decisions, right? And those hard decisions don't always feel good, but they're absolutely sometimes necessary. And the invitation here is pausing more around the types of decisions we're making to sustain trust and responsibility and hope, right? So to kind of to move us into this next piece, like I really want to continue to ponder on this question because what I want to do for our time together is I actually want to bring us through like three different frameworks of that are introduced in these closing chapters that really help us answer this question, right? And this question, as we're seeing in the chat, there's many different ways to answer this question, right? There is not one cookie cutter methodology to say how do we sustain trust and responsibility and hope. There's so many ways to do it, and there's so many mechanisms to do it as well. And I think our shared collective wisdom here is going to help us lend us that there, but also these frameworks to be really helpful. So we're really going to explore that wisdom and also really get into what actually helps us be in practice around leading in ways that sustain these efforts. And so I'm a firm believer that, some of us are gifted with leadership skills that are inherent in us since birth. Some of us have grown them over lifetimes and skills, right? Some are both, right? That we're always constantly in practice and evolving. And so when you're thinking about leadership, I want to sort of expand this view around leaders comes in many different forms, shapes, and sizes, and it's all about practice. What we did 20 years ago, 15, 10 years ago may shift on how we lead today during these times that we're in, right? And so leadership doesn't mean that we have a set way of leading. It means how do we match the moment and lead during these moments that we're in. And Brene talks about that beautifully in her book. So building in I kind of want to start with anchoring leadership and accountability, y'all. And so first off, let's get a pulse check. What does accountability mean to y'all? When you hear that term, accountability, we often reference it, right? What does it mean to you? Put it in the chat. When you hear the term accountability, what does that mean? Yes. Carol, owning what we say and do. Love that. Taking responsibility for your own actions, maintaining responsibility for our actions and decisions. Yes. Yep, Joseph, absolutely. Keep them coming. When you think about accountability, it's taking responsibility of our actions and most times the team's actions, holding others accountable as well. Yeah. So let's build on what y'all saying, right? So in the book, um, Brene leaves space and room for Aiko Bethia to really chime in on her practice and her book, Anchored, Aligned, and Accountable. And this quote I just want to reference, right? In the book is really talking about how we are anchored in our values and our leadership. And what she says is that we are anchored into our values, our impact is aligned with our values and actions, and we hold ourselves accountable to those impacts, right? So when we're thinking about anchored leadership, right, it asks us to continue to examine the relationship between as what y'all put in the chat, what we say we do and value, and how we act, and the impact those actions actually have on one another, including ourselves, right? It is not enough for us as leaders to articulate our values. The real work, actually, of leadership is ensuring that decisions, behaviors, and the systems in which we are navigating and building and curating reflect those commitments around how or what we actually value and put into practice. So we often talk about this in my practice or in my work as our guiding principles, right? What are the values that we hold and the principles that we hold ourselves accountable to? Because then if we don't define what those are, then we're saying accountability in the context of whose accountability, right? In what context, in what lens, right? Often it becomes a gray space that we're defining accountability without actually defining what those principles lie in, right? And so it's so important when we're thinking about, and what Aiko made me think about is like often when we are in team spaces or in our organizations, do we think about moments of pausing and defining what those principles are? How are we actually holding ourselves accountable? Right? Because accountability is subjective based on person, place, context, time, right? And so when you think about how we're defining accountability, it's so important to take a step back and say, well, how have we defined this as a leader with our team? How do I hold myself accountable through the shared values and principles I hold myself accountable to? And then also have my team and my organization define our shared principles of how we hold each other accountable, right? Those are two different practices and absolutely needed when we're talking about accountability. Right? Accountability, in a sense, is not simple or oversight or performance management or evaluation, right? Like, in a sense, accountability is about how are we responsible to people, to our mission, and to our community based on how we define that. And so, taking a moment to define actually what those are is important because that's what actually anchors us. So, a fun little story behind how I show up is that I often co facilitate in spaces with facilitators. And they come with their own stuff, y'all, right? Like we all are a part of a team. They like it this way. They like it, they like to facilitate in certain dynamics. And I'm like, great. So before we even start a project or facilitate, I ground ourselves in a conversation around like, what is our shared principle? How do we hold ourselves in this space together? And we actually write them down on a slide. How do we want to show up together in this curated space that we are facilitating? And these are like 5-10 minutes that we intentionally build together to build a relationship, but to also hold us accountable. And I do this deeply with other folks because it allows us to put our values forward, but now we know what we're accountable to, right? It's shared. It was a decision that we've made. And on top of that, we decided to share with the folks that we present to. This is how we show up with you together, right? And those are just micro moments of how we do that. And so when we do that, we're creating a culture where we're allowing space for us to reflect, to have feedback from one another, and then of course correct, right? Sometimes things go left in a facilitation or a team practice, and what holds us accountable is those principles that we talk through. Remember we said this? Remember we said that we were going to do that, right? Holding us accountable is how we define that accountability together. And I just want to say, like, building off this in closing, is that accountability often has been, and I will say this plainly, is that like it has been a burden in leadership for many, right? That term accountability brings up a lot of tension and fear, right? And like I'm just gonna name it. It has been one of those weaponized words that we have used and has caused some harm with because we have not defined it. And so when we're thinking about that in this context, is like, how are we doing a better job around using accountability, not as a burden of leadership, but one that builds leadership around trust and strengthening relationships, right? How are we defining accountability for ourselves and our team together? That's important here. So, to move us along, I kind of also want to talk about, in addition to accountability, right? We also got to talk about the elephant in the room often, which is power, y'all, right? So, power is one that often I think we are, in some ways, scared to even address and talk about in the room and space, right? And so, I kind of actually want to go back to the book for a moment because one powerful piece that is mentioned. Oh, Joseph, you said, if possible, can we double back a bit more about weaponizing accountability? Yes, absolutely, Joseph. Let me just take a pause back. So, before we get into power, like when we think about weaponizing accountability, right? I say that from the context, and Joseph, I just want to be clear. Are you asking for clarity around how we weaponize it, or just you want more context? I'm gonna ask you to unmute. There we
Okay.
go.
Thanks for muting me. I was trying to type it. Yeah, just looking for a little bit more clarity. That's all.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you for that. Yeah, so when we think about weaponizing accountability, it's sort of what we just been saying earlier, is that we throw terms out around like we need to hold leaders accountable. We have to, hold leadership accountable. Like however context we're using accountability can be weaponized when it's not defined together, right? And so when we don't define accountability, it creates room for people to fill in that definition from their own perspective, right? Which doesn't mean that, Joseph, your term or envision around accountability is the same way I define accountability, right? I might have a different lens of accountability versus you, and then yet we're talking about this accountability, but we're talking in circles around what we mean about accountability because we have not defined it together. And so, in some ways, it can be weaponized where we're saying this term, yeah, we have to hold accountability, but accountability to what context? How are we defining it? And how are we putting people under pressure around accountability when we have not yet defined what that meant or had a larger conversation about it? Right? And it can be weaponized if it's not thoughtfully curated in organizations where we actually are defining what we mean by accountability, because it's just then used as a term that holds us accountable that really nobody knows what the accountability is. Right? So we're just using it and weaponizing it, and then that creates a lot of tension in organizations and relationships because then we're defining accountability differently, and not from a sense of like building relationships, but more of like, I'm going to tell you what you're not doing. I'm going to tell you that you are not accountable. And we're not having those moments of pause around like, what exactly are we accountable to? Who, what, and why? What are the principles that we are sharing together that says we both agreed that we are going to show up in this way together? And this can be interpersonally, it can be within team dynamics, and it can be at a larger organization, right? But when we're using terms like accountability, it's so important that we don't weaponize it, but we define it. Okay, so I hope that was helpful, Joseph. Okay, awesome. So going back to that, and I appreciate you pausing me to kind of define that a little bit deeper. But it also brings me to thinking about power, right? And one ways in which I've seen also the weaponization of accountability is also how we don't talk about power in relationships to accountability and how it shows up in our interpersonal team relationships and organizations, right? So Brene actually talks a little bit about this. She introduced her the lock in and lock through method. So it was like a metaphor, right? Of a boat lock, right? Where essentially, I believe water levels are intentionally raised or lowered for boats to safely move between different elevations, right? And so she uses this metaphor to describe the transitions we navigate every day, moving from work to home, from professional roles to personal relationships, from one leadership context to the other, right? And so when we rush through these transitions, I believe she notes that we risk relational capsizing, right? Which is when we often go on autopilot. We are more reactive than responsive, right? And so, an intentional framework that she shared with us was an intentional locking through process. And locking through process is actually allowing us to shift the rhythm or cadence, right? Reset and enter the next space with presence and care, right? And there's a key word here around presence, right? And so this metaphor actually translates directly to leadership and power for me, right? As a boat locks, right, and helps, as a boat lock, like really helps vessels to move safely between levels, leaders must intentionally move between different forms of influence, responsibility, and relationship with people, right? And so without the intentional shift that we make, right, leaders can, like ourselves, and I've done this, I've been guilty, we've been locking in. And we often use that term, locked in, is like focus, right? I get focused, I need the task done, I have to get from here to here, right, with myself or my team or my organization, which that lock in kind of creates a narrow tunnel for ourselves, right, where there's zero room for adaptability and flexibility, right? And we've all been there, right? It's a sense of control and safety that we hold when we lock in, right? And what this book actually requires us is challenging that locked in, right, to locking through, which is carrying more of a dynamic, right, where we actually are not always locked in, although there's moments that we need to, but like there is a room and flexibility for us to actually create space for where we may not be in control, right? But we actually have to create more collaboration, trust, and shared leadership because this may be out of our control and power, right? And so Brené's concept around locked in and locked through invites us as leaders to reflect how influence operates within organizations and systems that we navigate every day. Leadership influence can either reinforce that control patterns of control, or it can be a pathway of opening for collaboration and shared leadership and collective responsibility where the pressure is not only on you, right? And that's an intentional pause, right? For us, when we find ourselves getting locked in because we're under pressure or we feel like we have to have the answer for something, the invitation is like, how do we actually lock through? Meaning, how do we intentionally transition our approach by allowing ourselves to give up and relinquish that power and control, to share that with relationship with people, and get those insights that actually might be helpful and a part of the solution long term, right? And so understanding power in this way is essential to sustaining actually how we build trust and accountability and hope with teams and communities that we support, right? It allows us to be aware of not what of the formal power that and authority that we have, but also the informal authority, right? And often the informal authority and power is often when we don't pause and understand that we have that, can actually erode relationships, and make decision making processes more singular than more collective. And this actually is what influences organizational culture. When we ignore power, when we lock in and remain control to outcomes, we disregard the collective wisdom of our team and folks that actually are part of leading the mission of an organization. And so it really helps us think about like who actually has decision making, right? Do I have decision making here? Can I share this or invite feedback, right? what type of formal or informal power do I have? And I'm always kind of, and I think it's funny because I always talk about power in my meeting spaces because it's often the one that we don't want to address in a space. Power is so important. And power is not a bad thing, y'all. It's okay to have power, right? It's neutral. Power can be effective and great. Sometimes, if it's unchecked power and we're running through people, right, it can be harmful too. But it's important to know power is important and a part of making the work happen. How do we do that is always the question. How do we leverage and use power in a way that actually um, creates an impact, a positive impact in our team, in the communities that we serve? All right. So, how I want to introduce that to y'all actually is ooh, great question, Howard. So, is responsibility and accountability the same thing or are they different? Ooh, okay. So, you know what? I want to invite this to the wisdom of the group. What do folks think? Like, truly, like when you think about responsibility and accountability, are they different or one and the same? What do folks feel? And you can raise your hand, yep, or put it in the chat. I often find that they are one of the same. Yep, okay. Thank you for that. And what you thinking? Oh,
I
yeah.
think that depending on the circumstance, they can be very different things.
Mm,
You can be held responsible and actually not have the elements that define accountability. And so
yeah.
oftentimes you can be held for outcomes that you really have no control over.
Mm-hmm.
I think they can be different.
Yeah. That's a great point. And absolutely. And it really depends on context, right? Yeah. And also how we define like accountability when it comes to ourselves. We're holding that accountability to ourselves versus our team. And responsibilities may differ between those interactions of how we're defining it. Right? Glenn, I'm curious around what
Yeah.
you're thinking.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Beautiful.
Yeah, I think they're related but different in my mind. How I define them, I think accountability, you're accountable. Accountability is between people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm accountable to show up on time and things like that. Responsibility is within people, is
Mm-hmm.
within yourself. I'm responsible. I can't take on ownership for your responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I can also say, hey, I need you to be accountable for this. So, I think sometimes in leadership, we try and take on responsibility on as someone's doing a project, how the project is done and how they get it done. That's their responsibility. We are accountable to the outcome.
Yeah.
So I kind of look at them related, but slightly different.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Yeah. And I think you're spot on. And much like Ann too, they are related. They're deeply intertwined. And I'm seeing in the chat too, like there is a duality. Like folks are sharing. Terrell, you mentioned responsibility is what we should do. Accountability is following through on your assignment even when it's uncomfortable. Yes, absolutely. So just to kind of put this into context, I think, for me, when it comes to accountability and responsibility, I want to name that there, as what y'all are mentioning, it's consistent upon context, but also it's a really about when we're thinking about accountability, there is a sense of responsibility in that, right? It's one of the same, right? And so they're not different in my lens as it relates to accountability. Once we like define accountability, we hold ourselves responsible to what those principles are, right? And so they're one of the same. I think when you think about accountability to what Terrell and others have mentioned, like accountability is what we lock through, right? When things get difficult, when we like have to follow through on a project or um a situation that we have to lead through, we are holding ourselves accountable, even though it might be a challenge. And the way we hold ourselves accountable, well, it's because it's how we define that accountability for ourselves and our team. We are holding ourselves into these set of principles and guiding principles that allow us to move forward through difficult times, and we hold ourselves responsible to that, right? But responsibility, as much as we put that in the context, a lot of folks, like, as much as people might be responsible for a project or team or an organization, responsibility doesn't mean you're accountable. Right? Yes, you can be assigned to a project, or you could be assigned to an initiative or team or organization, but it doesn't mean that you hold yourself to a standard of excellence, right? Depending on how you define that in accountability, right? Like, how are you in this responsibility accountable for the people? Responsibility doesn't mean that you know, um, we take a pause back and really invest in how we share power or dynamics, right? Responsibility is saying that we are an ownership of this, right? But in a slippery slope, if we don't really understand how we are looking at that responsibility, then we may run the risk of being in control and taking full ownership without actually sharing. Like, this responsibility is not only yours, but it's a team responsibility. It's an organization responsibility. It's a community responsibility, right? And so it's so important that we are like, it's one of the same, but also like we have to really be thoughtful in how we really respond, right? To when we are naming accountability, but also how are we defining them as well. And so responsibility, yes, like to your point, Scott, is often connected to our job. It's often connected to what we say we own. But accountability is actually what we do and how we hold ourselves accountable to the principles that we will get that responsibility done in a way that is rooted in a leadership practice, right? Around sharing power, around influence, recognizing, well, you can't do it by yourself, but we need to do it together. How do you bring people into the fold? So, and then like continue to be in conversation about this, right? Like as we sparsing this out, like these two concepts are one of the same. It's just about how we practice within them. That's the key here. It's like when you're thinking about how are you in responsibility to organizations, and how are you taking accountability, it's all about how are we defining that, and also how are we putting that into practice. But they're one and the same. So I know we kind of got into it a little bit, but I just want to like quickly close us out of our time and put y'all into deeper conversations, because I feel like there's a lot that needs to be said and shared, and I want to bring y'all into groups to be able to do that, and then share with the wisdom in the room as we close out our time together. But I do want to wrap up in talking about power. And as I mentioned, there's different frameworks to power that I want to just know and how we've seen show up in leadership. As I mentioned, power is a critical piece of how we lead and should not be ignored or not talked about. It's not a bad thing. It's all about how we use it, right? And so going back to the responsibility conversation, when we look at leadership from a sense of responsibility, it's important to think about who are we responsible to and who are we accountable to. We are accountable to ourselves, and we also need to define how we are accountable to others and how are we leading that charge. But sometimes we have taught that, like when depending on the context of your introduction to leadership, we have seen power over leadership style, meaning there is a reference of authority, right? I'm a leader, I have the authority, I make the decisions, and I really exercise that authority through control, hierarchy, or dominance. And we've seen that, right? It's kind of the boss energy. There's a difference between a boss and a leader, right? And so I've met a few bosses in my lifetime. And listen, right? Like, as much as they had authority and, power, they were not influential and effective in an organization because they had this power over mentality that gave them a boss energy that people did not like. So, like, retention rates were low. People were leaving, right? Like, the organization would show that actually people don't like to be under power over, right? People like to actually be in power with, right? Like, how are we sharing this responsibility and ownership of an organization, of an effort, right? And so power over is sometimes a role that we execute power over that sometimes is an old-fashioned tool of how we have been conditioned to think of leadership, where actually it's the most ineffective way, right? The world doesn't need bosses. The world needs more leaders, right? And sharing that power. And it brings me under to, like, just as much as there's power over, there's power under, right? So, like, there's folks, right, and within organizations that often disengage, right, because of feeling powerless, right? So these are like slow quitters, right? These are folks that, like, when we feel a sense of exclusion in an organization, or feel like our voices are not valued in spaces, well, we feel power under. We disengage. Sometimes there's resistance. Sometimes we just completely feel disempowered within an organization or a system. And so we position ourselves power under, where we say, I'm not even going to make a rise out of that because my value or my voice doesn't really matter in this. And so sometimes we do this, right? Like, we position ourselves in power under, depending on culture, right? Or how power shows up in an organization. The real plug here is power with, right? And so when we're looking at what you have control over, what you're responsible to in terms of accountability, is how are you leading in ways that works with power, that is more collaborative, right, as a leadership model? How are we creating this shared responsibility, this mutual influence and collective problem solving, where the pressure is not on you, but you extend that and invite folks to be a part of the solutions, right? Good solutions, the most challenging solutions. Power with is a practice in which no matter what you're receiving above you, right? Because I feel like we all, in leadership, we always have folks that, that lie above us, right? No matter what position you are in an organization, in a hierarchy system. But, like, no matter what comes from above in your leadership practice, you are sharing power within your leadership model, where you're not going to translate that empower balance to your team, but you're actually going to shift how that power is distributed, right? Although the final decision, it leads on you, you invite people into the process. And actually, people really respect and value that, right? They know the decision's on you in most cases. That's okay. The decision needs to be had, right? But when you invite feedback and actually leverage that information to help you make decisions, well, that's a game changer. Because now you have buy-in, you have people who feel respected and valued, who are willing to move through the most challenges experiences with you because they felt like they had been a part of the solution or the process, right? And so that, to me, is very impactful, is when we don't abandon power like it doesn't exist, but we use power with people and we leverage their brilliance and their wisdom in the room. So in closing, in the book, it talks a lot about how leadership is a team sport, right? Unleashing the power of collective wisdom is exactly doing power with, right? We need to really leverage our leadership as a collective movement. And Abby talks a lot about this in the closing chapter around effective leadership is a tool to think about how we lead from the front, but also it's not always us leading from the front, but we have to empower others to lead as well, right? It's a shared leadership, right? And I'm like, sometimes we got to let the ego go, right? We do not need the ego, right, to lead us. And sometimes it can, right? I'm guilty in ways that like my ego sometimes shows up, right? But it's a part of us. And so it's so important that we are actually mindful of when we are in leadership roles, how are we leading sometimes, and when we actually need to support others in their leadership, right? And where we need to actually empower people. I often, when I have a team that's looking for me for answers, I actually pause and say, you know what, as much as I think I know the answer, I want to leverage your leadership in this. What do you think we should do? How do you think we should move? What's your feedback? What are you thinking? Because it creates more room for them to not look only to me for decisions, but empowers them to lead as well, right? And sometimes those small reframing of a question could actually create more power with and have a shared responsibility of a situation rather than you as the leader of the team, right, to make the only decision. Sometimes it's just a reframe of a question and say, what do you think? How do you think we should move? It's less about being the hero, but more about building the conditions in which others can lead as well. That's true leadership. So in that, I think my most favorite quote in the world, y'all, is Viktor Frankl. And it's really rooted in this concept around when leaders pause, instead of providing instant answers, they shift their organizational culture from dependency to collective efficacy, right? And so it's reminding us that sometimes when you think about, before we lock into decisions, before we lock into any process, locking through with people is actually the pausing of, before we even respond, how do we pause? And this invitation that Brene invites us to is the beautiful work of Viktor Frankl, which is an Australian psychologist, but also a Holocaust survivor, which many people don't know. Well, he says between stimulus and response, there is a space, right? Between any stimulus and response, there is this space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. And our response lies growth and our freedom, right? So sit with that. This quote is basically inviting us as leaders that we don't have to be reactive. We actually don't. That's the worst thing we can do. That erodes trust. That creates a lack of accountability. But we actually create more moments of space for a response, we get so much clarity of how we need to lead. If we take more intentional moments of pause, yes, and there is power in the pause, right? There's so much power in the pause. And sometimes we feel like we don't have that pause because we are in autopilot, or there's pressure or fear, right? But if you calm that noise inside you and you step away from situations, you go for a walk, you take a moment of reprieve, right? You actually allow that space for yourself to be more responsive. And in that space, you actually have so much growth and so much freedom to make a choice that actually builds connection rather than destroys connection, creates more clarity for your team and yourself, right? And so actually we want more of an environment, a world where we pause more. It's absolutely necessary to pause. Because what happens if we don't, well, we get reactive decisions that actually creates more harm that we have to clean up, y'all. Right? And you spend more energy, resources, and time cleaning that up because we are reactive. If we are more responsive, we actually get to slow down and create the conditions that actually make it an effective workplace and effective leaders in our communities, including ourselves. So, with that being said, I feel like I've been talking a lot, y'all, and I appreciate you putting in the chat, chiming in, and sharing your wisdom. And what I would love for y'all to do is to bring us back to this question around how do we actually lead in ways that sustain trust, responsibility, and hope, right? This is the foundation of our question. And what we're gonna do, and May, I want to, of course, invite you in here. I know we have breakout rooms, but we have three core questions that each room will be, or assigned a question rather. And the question is, how do we, as leaders, hold responsibility while maintaining connection to others? Right, going back to the question around accountability versus also responsibility, diving into that concept a little bit more deeper. How do we lead in ways that sustain hope and humanity even when conditions are difficult? And how does accountability look like in practice, not just as a principle that we hold ourselves to? All right. So, May, are we going to break them out into groups?
Yes.
All right. As we come back. All right. So y'all, we're gonna take a few minutes. How was the session? Like, what were some gems or wisdom that y'all want to share? Like that came out. Mike, I see you come off mute. Mike is ready, so let's jump right into it. What's
Yeah,
going
yeah, I
on?
made a critical leadership mistake.
Okay.
I thought like context and shared context would be important. It wasn't until the last minute that I said, oh, by the way, somebody is going to need to facilitate or share back our response. And they voted me as the person to do that. So, yeah, but great insights, I think. We tackled how do you hold responsibility while remaining connected to others, and really spoke about a real life situation, if you will. And I think kind of learned that it's knowing upfront how the decision is going to be made is really important. Ultimately, is it hey, it's going to be shared decision making. So at the end of this, we can agree to disagree. By majority rule, we're going to make a decision and everyone needs to abide by that. Versus, hey, I'm the leader. It's up to me. I'll take your input. But the buck stops with me. So I'm going to kind of use my power over, not the ideal scenario, right? Or it's consensus, which is the best possible, right? So we all talk through it and we're able to achieve consensus through negotiation back and forth or discussion back and forth. So just talked about different ways to make a decision as a leader, but setting that context up front is important. Then we also tackle a little bit about hope and humanity and their the kind of the values or that were important characteristics, empathy, being positive, being solution oriented, making sure that or trying to afford people the opportunity to bring solutions forward so that we have multiple different ways of thinking about how to solve that challenge. Transparency and vulnerability were added into. So kind of five pillars, I guess, of making or keeping hope and humanity alive in a difficult situation.
Yes. Beautiful, Mike. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm like taking some notes because I actually want to gather as much wisdom to share it back with y'all, but I want to invite others to build on what Mike shared. What else came up in your breakout rooms? Chris, I see you. What's going on?
And feel free anybody from my team who wants to expand on this. But we had a lot of educators in our group, and so there was good conversation about the challenges between power over and power under, especially with students and sort of that hierarchy there, and how you can collaborate together to involve them in the process and engage them more in that relationship and learning. We talked about modeling the behavior you want to see, that oftentimes in leadership roles or hierarchy positions, there's that attitude of certain behavior or certain actions are beneath you. Talking about sort of the janitor and the receptionist at the school play just as important a role as a teacher or principal. So those components of being aware that we're all part of a collaborative team that makes an impact, and when those pieces fall apart, it's visible to everybody. So just building on relationships and the accountability of sort of managing those systems.
Powerful.
Well done for our group.
Thanks, Linda.
For my group, I really would like to almost, I want to say piggyback, but I think just build off of the two facilitators who shared out. And in terms of the context and composition of the group that's being led, there is a difference in the weight around what is accountability and what responsibility is. And so in our group, we actually had someone in a command position in a fire department. And so really understanding how critical it is that each individual on the team understands what their role is, what they're responsible for. They have to be held accountable for doing their job the way it needs to be done, when it needs to be done. That impacts on the performance of the entire team, on the outcomes, and on the potential saving of life and property. So that was really, really great. I had a lot of participation in my group. I thank them for that. Another theme that came out was around compassion, compassion, also the humanity piece. And we had someone that was willing to share a very poignant experience where they worked under a supervisor who was a very strong person in terms of how they led each other, but was a very, let's say, weak person in terms of their humanity and their ability to really work with their staff. And she shared with us the difference that she experienced in her career when that individual left and was replaced by somebody that really understood the dynamics of accountability, responsibility, and how to really involve your team in the work of the organization. So thank you to my team.
I'll share quickly if we have a minute. So I just will say that our team, we kind of talked a lot about the need to sort of do this work ourselves before we're asking others to kind of, on our team, to be willing to work together and collaborate and have this sort of shared understanding of culture and guiding principles, that as the leader, we also have to do that work, and we have to be willing to sort of pivot. We talked about opening up communication to people. Like, I loved that one member in our group shared that he borrowed a phrase from his gym that says "no judgment zone," and that in a communication, I'm going to use that this summer. I actually like that, like inviting conversation from your team. And, because I've worked in an organization where you're not really invited to openly share, right? Like, you can share if you're going to say what I want you to say, but kind of being in a space of really opening it up to what people say, and that there is room and space for you to have a different opinion from me, and for me to sort of like respond to that as the leader. I think that it connects you a lot to your staff. It really shares the onus if you've also done that work and held that mirror up to yourself. And we talked about having new people in your organization that come in, and I love that you talked about that, Mari, about that mirror. It's like, especially when new people come in, they see your holes. And if you're willing to hear that and see that as an opportunity for growth, not as a criticism, I think it goes a long way for your team. So that's kind of what we talked about in our group.
Oh, thank you, Carol.
I don't know if we have time.
We do.
We do? Okay. And I'll also invite any group member who wants to add to please do so. We talked about this initially, about the hope and humanity piece and the importance of really listening and hearing people and remembering bottom line, we're all human. And that then when we talked somewhat about the question, I think from Scott in our group was about how do you balance empathy and accountability, which I think is a interesting and challenging question sometimes. And I think we talked a bit about, again, people need to know you care about them as people. And when they know that, then you can be clear but kind, as Brene Brown, I think, talked about. And then when we talked about the issue of remaining connected and sustaining, holding responsibility, what was emphasized was the importance of communication, of being really open, clear, transparent, honest in our communication. And then we were talking a little bit about specific things to hold people accountable. So again, here people is really important, but also we talked about clear expectations. How will I know when I've achieved them? So something measurable. And regular feedback as some ingredients to accountability.
Wow, y'all. I mean, y'all shared so much beautiful things, and I appreciate you, Howard, and everyone for chiming in and sharing their wisdom. I think just to kind of close us off here, I hear a lot, and I just want to bring this back to y'all of what we just shared together. First off, it takes a lot of courage. It's right, like a lot of courage to lead in the ways in which y'all described, right? I just want to name that it is not easy and it's hard. And sometimes when we think about responsibility, doing the tasks, right, and getting the work done, and versus accountability, which is like it's our framework of how we hold ourselves and with when the responsibility is hard or not, right? That's that framework and principle that we really lean on, that doesn't only hold responsibility at the place, but like when you said empathy and accountability, well, they're one and the same, right? It's a part of our framework. Accountability means empathy, means compassion, means showing up in our humanity. It means pausing. It means, right? Like that's accountability doesn't mean check mark, you got it done. I feel like you know what I mean, you have successfully did your responsibility. Accountability is, well, how are we showing up in our humanity? And so and it takes a lot of courage, and sharing context is important. And I just want to also leave y'all with like modeling the way is often the challenge in our leadership, where sometimes there isn't a way forward, but we're modeling despite having clarity on the other side. Sometimes the presence allows us to get clarity through the process, and having mirrors to inform and put our practice into practice, right, allows us to really get feedback in real time. And as you're getting feedback, right, I think something that I heard that I want to just chime in really quickly here is we often use the term, let's agree to disagree, right? And I actually want to provide a different perspective on that. What if we agree to agree? Because agreeing to disagree is just too easy. It's just too easy, right? Oh yeah, you go your way, we go, but I go my way, but the tension is still there. We are just gonna act like it's not there. And actually that is the most and I'm gonna just name it, sometimes it can be so toxic in environments. But when we actually do intentional ways of holding ourselves accountable, it's like, accountability is, for me, is recognizing, well, we are in a disagreement. How do we show up and agree to agree the way to move forward? It might look different for both of us, but we're going to agree on what the mechanism is. And that is real work, and it's hard and it's challenging. And it may take a series of conversations and modeling, but sometimes that's absolutely what's needed to hold ourselves accountable. Is that it's too easy to agree to disagree. We're going to have to find a solution. And it might look different for both of us, but where can we find that medium? And there's always opportunities there. It might not be perfect, right? That's a whole different thing, right? But it will get the work done. It will move us forward, even if it's an increment. So, with that being said, thank you for this opportunity to be a part of this conversation, y'all. It has been such a gift and a pleasure to be in community with you. And I do hope y'all have a wonderful rest of the first quarter leading into the next quarter. And as we get into warmer weather, may you find more moments of pause and reflection and joy. We absolutely need that in this work as leaders. And I do hope that you do experience that in your days and weeks ahead. All right. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Thank you, Mari. Thank you to our facilitators. Thank you for all of you. We really appreciate your time, your investment, your insight, and collaboration this morning. Stay tuned for some exciting events and opportunities from Leadership Greater Hartford this spring. And thank you for your time this morning, friends. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the sunshine. Take good care. Thanks, Mari.